The greatest financial crisis that America is facing, and maybe the world, is our accumulation of debt. We have way too much of it. I'm talking about government debt and personal debt, consumer debt, and corporate debt. I like to focus on government debt, however, because it's easy to understand. The U.S. government, for example, has a deficit of at least $1 trillion every year when its total budget is only $4 trillion. So this is like you having an income of $40,000 a year and adding $10,000 to your debt every year. So this is a big problem, but it's a problem that's really hard to get people worked up about because it's such a slow-moving thing. It's like the San Andreas Fault that's building up tension, and you know there's going to be an earthquake at some point, but you don't know if it's going to be tomorrow or 50 years from now. Obviously, it can't go on forever accumulating debt, but no one knows how it's going to end or when it's going to end or what the spark is going to be. Now, all of that is changing in the next couple of decades because we have another crisis on top of that is rolling towards us at a much faster pace. And that's kind of a surprising crisis. It is the retirement of the baby boomers. The baby boomers, of course, were the big bulge of children that were born between 1946 and 1964. And they kind of rolled through the 20th century. And as they did, they brought great economic prosperity to the latter section of the 20th century, all the way from the late 70s to the early 2000s. We had a big economic boom that was powered by all of these baby boomers, all of these people in the workforce, and very few dependents, very few old people and children. And the crisis that is happening now is this big bulge of people is moving into their senior years. And as of 2011, the oldest of them turned 65, and they're beginning to retire. The retirement of the baby boomers is a crisis for the boomers themselves because most of them don't have enough money to retire on. But setting aside their particular problem, the retirement of the boomers has a devastating effect on the entire economy. And I want to talk about what are those effects of having these boomers retire. To me, it boils down to four mechanisms, four vectors by which the boomers are destroying the world. The first is that as they retire, as they get old, they're drawing on government resources. So instead of paying taxes, they're now drawing on government resources for Social Security, for Medicare, for other things. So they're a net drain on the government, and the government that is already deeply in debt and already has $1 trillion a year in deficits is going to have even more. It's going to double, triple its deficits because it has this huge freight train of expenses coming down the line. So that's one thing, the expenses, what the baby boomers are going to cost the government. Point two is that the boomers, by definition, when they retire, they are leaving the workforce and they're not producing any economic benefit anymore. They are not producing a wage. And more importantly, they are not generating any tax income. So the government is hit from both sides. It's suffering more expenses from these old people requiring services, and they're getting less taxes from the old people not working. So again, this is going to explode whatever deficits we have, and they're going to get far worse. A third effect of the baby boomers is that once you retire, your whole mode of consuming changes. You become a different kind of consumer, mainly in that you don't consume anymore. You stop buying stuff. As soon as people retire, or they're thinking of retiring, or they're trying to retire, they cut their expenses way down low. They don't buy things anymore that they don't absolutely need. This includes real estate. They are downsizing in real estate. They're getting rid of their big houses, and they're dumping their big houses on the market. And they're reducing, and they're not buying cars like they used to. They're buying the cars only when they need to. And the reason for their frugality is really quite simple. When you retire, you have a fixed amount of money at your disposal, the money that you've saved, and you don't know how long you're going to live. So the money you've saved may get you through the next 20 years, but what if you end up living 30 years? Then you're really screwed because you will have spent all your money. And seniors are very aware of this. They don't know how long they're going to live, and they are terrified of running out of money before they die. So they cut their expenses and they don't buy anything, which again is devastating for the economy. The boomers, by the way, know how to be frugal, because when they were growing up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they grew up in big families, and these families were very frugal. They knew how to save money. They knew how to squeeze every dollar. So they're kind of going back to that mode that they already had in their nervous system. And now they're not buying stuff. So in the beginning, throughout most of the 20th century, they were big spenders. Now they're non-spenders. And this is going to be devastating for anybody who sells a consumer product. Anybody who sells real estate, anyone who sells cars, it's going to be bad for them because the boomers, the retired people, aren't buying stuff. And there's a fourth devastating mechanism by which the boomers are going to destroy the economy. And that's kind of a subtle one and kind of something you wouldn't think of at first. But these boomers right now are heavily invested in equities, in stocks. They're into the stock market big time. And they're doing that because the traditional way of saving for retirement, which is putting your money in the bank, isn't working anymore. It hasn't been working for a decade now. Interest rates have been so low that any form of fixed income just isn't generating any extra income for you. You're not adding to your nest egg like people expect to. They know they've got to have so much money in the bank to retire on, so they take risks by jumping into equities and putting all their resources into equities. And I've heard it said that the high end of the boomers have 70% of their wealth invested in the stock market. Why is that significant? Because as they're going through their retirement years, they have to draw that money out to live on. They've got to sell those stocks so they can pay their bills and go on living. So if you've got $1 million in the stock market, you've got to take $50,000 or $100,000 out every year to support your lifestyle. This means that all of those retirees are forced sellers in the marketplace. There's money flowing out of the stock market. And if the stock market hasn't taken this into account, there's going to be a crash. Right now, this is May of 2019, and stock prices are at an all-time high, and price-to-earnings ratios are at a high, and none of this is supportable if we have a lot of people taking out money from the stock market over time. So what this all adds up to is enormous stress on the U.S. government, which may finally push it over the edge, enormous stress on the consumer economy, which doesn't have any consumers anymore from this segment of the population, and enormous stress on the stock market, because the boomers ultimately, over the next decade, are going to be taking all of their money out of stocks and spending that money on essentials. So if the government is going to collapse, if there's going to be a debt crisis where the government can't pay its debts or consumers can't pay its debts, it's going to happen now. That is, within the next decade or two. It's not something like the San Andreas fault that might actually happen 50 or 100 years from now. This is going to happen soon, maybe even this year. This whole rolling series of defaults that has to happen. And you may ask for solutions. What is the solutions to the baby boom retirement crisis? And the bottom line is there is no solution, but let me run through the solutions anyway to show you why. We could cut Social Security. We could eliminate Social Security, or make it, you have to be 75 before you collect Social Security. We could reduce Medicare. We could stop paying people's medical bills when they get over 65. All of these are completely politically unpalatable. And even if they weren't, even if you could really pull it off, that's only going to push the problem ahead a few years. It's not going to solve the problem, because ultimately people get old. No matter how you slice it, you can take away their retirement, but they're still going to get old. And when they get old, they get frail. They have lots of diseases, lots of needs for medical care. And, well, you can cut all these people off from medical care, but that's both inhumane and politically impossible. And the fact is that elders, retired people, are a very powerful voting bloc that doesn't like anyone messing with their benefits. So these people, not only do they have huge numbers on their side, but unlike younger adults, retired people are much more likely to vote. So if some politician comes along and proposes cutting Social Security, these boomers are going to kick this guy out of office, because they don't want anybody, they're desperate. They don't have enough money for retirement. If someone threatens to come along and cut off their Social Security, they're going to be mad as hell. And they don't care about what the future of the country is, because they won't be around to see it. They just don't want their monthly payments to be reduced. So you can't cut expenses. You can't really cut any of these expenses. That's point one. Point two is, so how do we get more workers to pay more taxes? Well, there is a solution to that, and that is immigration. You go overseas and you steal workers from other countries. You open the floodgates and you let them in. And this is actually an ideal solution to a lot of things, because when you let people in, you let in immigrants, you're letting in people who are ready to work right away. Ready to go to work, often in skilled jobs that pay a lot of money. They're willing to pay taxes right away. And our country did not have to invest in their upbringing. It just steals them in adulthood and uses them as a tax base. That's great if you can pull it off. The problem is the financial difficulties of the federal government are so great that you'd have to admit a lot of immigrants. I'm talking like millions a year to make up for all the shortfall that the government's going to have. And we all know from the election of Donald Trump that there's a big backlash against immigrants, people who are already here, who came over on the Mayflower or whatever, object to new people coming, new people with different skin tone or from different cultures. And that's a big thing. It's enough to get Donald Trump elected. So obviously there's a limit to how many immigrants you can bring in. Canada is probably the poster child for bringing in immigrants, but even they have huge fiscal problems, even with their huge immigrant stream coming in. The third problem you can't solve is you can't force old people to spend money. Okay, you can't force anybody to spend money, and the fact is, if they don't know how long they're going to live, they want to conserve their funds, and that's just unchangeable. The only thing they're ever going to spend money on is medical care to keep them alive, and the government is taking care of that. The fourth thing was the stock market. These guys, all these baby boomers, are going to be pulling out of the stock market because they've got to liquidate their stocks to pay for their retirement. That again cannot be changed. So we're between a rock and a hard place. There is no solution. It's like all of this debt that the government is accumulating and that consumers is accumulating. It's like we're building a pile of dynamite, and every year we throw more sticks of dynamite onto the pile, and all it really requires is something to set the pile of dynamite off with. And that's without the baby boomers. Now, the baby boomers retiring is like a big steamroller, very slowly moving toward that big pile of dynamite, and it starts squishing the pile of dynamite. And maybe that doesn't set the dynamite off, but it sure makes it a lot easier for the dynamite to be set off. So you've got a big steamroller on a pile of dynamite, and all it takes is just a little spark to set the whole thing off and to create a rolling default crisis. Basically, if people keep spending money that they don't have and they keep jacking up their debt, be they a government or an individual, sooner or later there comes a point when you can't make payments on that debt. Your credit rating crashes and suddenly everybody is defaulting on their debt. You can imagine this happening first with student loans. People just don't have the money, so they stop paying their student loans, and they stop paying their mortgages, and they stop paying their credit cards. All of these things are rolling defaults that once they start going, it's going to affect other parts of the economy, and soon everything is collapsing. Just imagine the crisis in 2008, when we had a banking crisis that very nearly destroyed the banking system, if not for the government intervening. Well, that could happen again, except this time the government doesn't have the tools to intervene. It can't borrow any more money. It can't lower interest rates below zero. So this time things are really going to collapse. The banking system is really going to collapse. The government is really going to start defaulting. People are going to be defaulting all over the place. Now, I cannot tell you what that spark will be, the final thing that sets everything off. It's like predicting when the San Andreas Fault is going to break. You don't know exactly where it's going to break or how it's going to break. You only know that it is going to break. And the baby boomers retiring over the next 10, 20, 30 years is a stress that is bound to set things off. It's bound to put enough pressure on this dynamite that it has to go off one way or another. So I wish I could be more positive, and I am positive in the long run. This is a short-term crisis. It is a Great Depression, if you will. It's going to be a dark age. It's going to be a very difficult time for everyone on the planet. But humanity will find a way through. I see it as like a big bankruptcy. So humanity has to go through this bankruptcy where it loses all its debt, and then it can restructure itself in some new way. Maybe it's without a U.S. government, maybe it's without a banking system, but humanity will find a way to restructure itself and rebuild itself, and then it's going to face another set of crises. I'm talking about the long-term demographic problems of humanity. Producing enough babies. We just have to get through the baby boom crisis first before we can even think about those things. Valley of Fire, Nevada, about an hour out of Las Vegas. It's after dark now. Don't know what to say about this place. It's pretty red. It's really red here.